Chris Proctor, a weed management extension educator. I was just going to talk a little bit about some things to think about and consider after hail comes through your field. So it's not the situation you want to be in, but there's a number of things to think about, and one of the things that comes up a lot of times after hail comes through is, well, what does that do to my weed management plan? And so I got a number of things to cover just to kind of think through that process. So in many ways, when you think about the timing of hail, when it typically shows up, you know, that's usually a mid-season event. And for these mid-season events, at this time of the season, if everything's happy, if everything's going the way we want, we're really relying mostly on canopy closure, canopy cover to provide our weed control. And so everything up to this point has been working towards getting a dense closed canopy because it's that canopy that gives us the extended weed control through the rest of the season. And so really it's a dense canopy that kind of holds those weeds back. Even if our herbicides start to peter out, even if they slow down a little bit, by that point in the season, the canopy is usually dense enough that it can keep the weeds out for the remainder of the season. But if you get hail, obviously that's going to open the canopy up, and that's going to change the dynamics quite a bit. And so now there's a number of things to think about in terms of weed control, because that canopy is no longer doing the work that you were hoping it was going to do. So this picture here, this is just showing underneath a corn canopy mid-season. You can see you got really good canopy coverage, very little light getting through. We had a good early season weed program, and we're able to keep the weeds out. And so if this canopy stayed intact, you can imagine that you'd get good weed control for the rest of the season. However, after hail, you can see this field here, that canopy was opened up. So even though these plants have matured, they've begun to tassel, that canopy never filled back in. And so you can see you got pretty large gaps there between the rows where the weeds have come in and really are going to cause some problems with this corn crop. And so this is where having a good weed management plan following hail can be important. One of the things to consider as you're thinking about weed control and canopy coverage and how hail might affect that is most of our residual products, so the products that we spray on the soil that have an extended residual, they last for most products, we're looking at the 30 to maybe 40-day range after they're applied before they're no longer effective. So this is showing a number of different products that are typically used in soybean, and you can see they really range from that 30, 35-day. There's a couple that extend just a little bit longer into that maybe 40-plus day range, but really it's about that 30-day range. So this is just showing the same idea just in a little bit different way. And so you can see there on the left-hand side, you can imagine applying a pre-emerge herbicide. And you have this red line here, and that's kind of that threshold of concentration that you need for good weed control. So as long as you have that much herbicide in the soil, you're going to get good weed control. And as that herbicide begins to break down due to sunlight, moisture, microbial activity, a number of different things will break that herbicide down. As that breaks down, the concentration drops. And once it drops below this threshold, that's when weeds are going to start to break through. So typically what we recommend is you apply your pre, that'll give you good weed control all the way into June. But once you start getting to that 20 to 30-day window after you applied, you start risking that concentration dropping. And so often folks will come back with a second application, a layered residual. And so you can see that second application time there around June 1st. And that bumps that concentration soil back up. And that extends how long you can go into the season and maintain good weed control. But even with this layered residual, right, this only gets us sometime into August, right, before that, even that residual begins to break down. And at that point, the goal is to have a closed canopy, and that's going to get us the rest of the way through the season. And so really we layer our residuals, and then we rely on a dense canopy to get us the rest of the way. Well, in a hail situation, if hail comes in here mid to late August after your concentrations drop below that threshold and that canopy goes away, well, now you have a situation where those weeds can start to emerge up through, break through that residual. Another thing to consider, and so you think about, well, what do I need to think about if my field's been hailed, my residuals are starting to break, what does that mean for my weed control? Well, I think in this situation it's really important to pay attention to, well, what weeds do you have in your system? Because different weeds have different biology, they're going to emerge at different times. And so really paying attention to what weeds you have in your field, and knowing a little bit about the biology, especially when do they emerge? So if you have some of the early emerging weeds, so you see up here at the top, you have the kochias, the ragweeds. Those are going to come up late March, early April, maybe just a little bit into May, and then they're pretty well done. And so if you're getting hail somewhere into the June range, more than likely those aren't the weeds you're going to be dealing with. It's as you move later into the season, you have some of these, the pigweeds become a real problem. So the redwood pigweeds, water hemp, palmer, those can be real serious issues because they have a really long emergence window. Some of the morning glories are kind of that same way. They tend to have that really long window of emergence. They can emerge late into the season. So those are the weeds you want to pay attention to because those are the ones you're going to want to target when you're potentially selecting another herbicide that you might add into your system. This is just another way of showing that same idea. So this is looking at water hemp in Nebraska. And so you can see top left on the 7th of June, water hemp might begin to emerge. And so you might, tail end of May, first part of June, you're going to see that first flush of water hemp. It's going to come up. If you let it go, by the 15th of July, a lot of that water hemp will have matured, begin seeding if you didn't do anything to manage it. But then if you look at that lower left picture, here we are all the way to August 20th, and you can see a mature water hemp plant that escaped, continued to grow, has put on leaves, might be getting close to maturity, putting on seed as well. But scattered around that large water hemp plant, there's a number of new water hemp seedlings that have emerged. And so that just shows that water hemp can be really challenging. You have emergence in June, but you can also have emergence all the way to the end of August. And so things that you do in June to manage water hemp aren't going to stick around long enough, typically, to still be effective come the end of August. And that's particularly true in a hail situation where that canopy opens back up, where the canopy might have kept those late emerging water hemp at bay. They would have come up and got spindly and maybe petered out or died. If that canopy opens up and there's sunlight and moisture, they'll just take off. And you can see then by the end of September, you could have a real weed problem on your hands. So just a couple things to highlight, just think through what are some things I need to pay attention to following hail in terms of weed control. And so crop growth stage is one. What are your replant options, rotation restrictions? That's another thing to pay attention to. Just thinking a little bit about rotation or grazing restrictions. If there's any opportunity to graze either a cover crop or the crop that was hailed, just paying attention to what herbicides are applied will be important. And then lastly, just thinking about, is there an opportunity to apply an additional herbicide application following hail, and what you might think through in that situation. So let's just walk through these. Thinking through crop growth stage. So most herbicides have some kind of limitation in terms of how late you can apply them to a growing crop before that herbicide is restricted. So this comes from the Guide for Weed Disease and Insect Management in Nebraska. We've done a really nice job pulling out a lot of the different label recommendations for different herbicides, and we've summarized them in the book. So it's always important to go back to the label and double check because these things change quickly or we might have missed something. But this is a nice place to start, and then it gives a nice summary. And there's a page in here that talks about the growth stage limits for different herbicides and for different crops. And so if I just pull this out and zoom in on it so you can see it a little bit better, if we take 2,4-D, for example, in a corn crop, 2,4-D is restricted to an 8-inch height if you're broadcast applying it. And so that doesn't give you much time. In a lot of these hail situations, especially mid-season, late season, hail injury, so you're going to be well past that 8-inch mark. And so if you wanted to keep your corn crop, but you were worried about weeds that had started to emerge through, well, you couldn't go over the top and spray 2,4-D because you went past that growth stage restriction at 8 inches. However, in this instance with 2,4-D, if you use a directed application, so you have drop nozzles and you're directing it and not just spraying it over top of the canopy, well, that'll let you go all the way up to right up until tassel you can spray 2,4-D, and so that could give you a little bit larger window. And so just paying attention, all these herbicides are going to have different recommendations in terms of what size they'll allow a post-emergence application for different crops, and so paying attention to that will be really important. Thinking through what are my replant options. So the question always becomes, am I going to keep the crop that was hailed, or do I need to change directions? Do I need to replant and go to something else? So something that needs to be paid attention to, if you decide that crop isn't salvageable and you need to do something different, if you need to replant, one of the things you need to take into consideration before you replant is what previously applied herbicides are out there in my system, and what effect might those have on this crop I'm going to replant. Again, I'm going to take you back to the weed guide and just highlight some of this information. So we have a lot of this information summarized here. And if we zoom in on the Fierce XLT label, just as an example, we say Fierce XLT, and if you look across one of these lines here, this is the number of months you need to wait after applying Fierce XLT before you can plant the crops that are listed in these different columns. And so if you come down below here and you look, Fierce XLT, soybean can be planted any time. And so it's a soybean herbicide, and so if you had soybeans that were hailed and you decide to replant soybeans, well, there's no restriction then to replant Fierce XLT in that situation. You'd be just fine. If for some reason, let's say you wanted to plant grain sorghum, you thought we're getting late in the season, grain sorghum does well under heat, a little bit lower water, that might be a good opportunity to switch to grain sorghum instead of finishing up the season with soybean because we were hailed. Well, if you come and you look at Fierce XLT, what's the recommendation for grain sorghum? If you follow this line across, you can see grain sorghum requires 18 months after applying Fierce XLT before you can replant to grain sorghum. So in this situation, if you'd applied Fierce in the spring, you wouldn't be able to replant grain sorghum in this situation. So there's a lot of different scenarios you can imagine depending on what you applied and then what crop you're intending to replant to pay attention to. And so this weed guide can kind of help get you in the right ballpark. But then again, you really want to go and look at the label and make sure that the label matches what you see here in the guide when you're thinking about those options. Another thing to consider is grazing restrictions. And so whenever you're planting a forage cover crop, so let's say the soybeans were too far damaged, they weren't recoverable, you decided to abandon that crop, but maybe a good option might be to come back and plant a cover crop because that canopy's opened up, you could drill a cover crop in there, you got a long season, but to add some additional value to that, there's opportunity to graze it. And so what are the options in terms of grazing? What do you need to think about? When you're thinking about grazing and herbicides, it's really important to know what were the previously applied herbicides, and then what are the subsequent herbicide applications that I might want to make, and how could that potentially affect my herbicide choices. So again, I'm going to take you back to the weed guide. We have a section here that look at grazing restrictions. If I pull out this herbicide verdict, so if you had a corn crop, let's just say it was a total failure, you decide that you're gonna drill something into there that would be a forage option. Well, there's a couple of things that you really need to pay attention to. One, when I'm thinking about grazing, the grazing restriction most specifically applies to the crop to which that herbicide was applied. So in this case, if verdict was applied in the spring over top of corn, the grazing restriction speaks about what restrictions are there to grazing the corn crop. It says nothing about the subsequent crop. So that's another discussion. So you really have to pay attention here. So if you look at verdict, corn or popcorn silage can be harvested, fed, or grazed 80 or more days after application. So if you simply wanted to go and graze the corn residue that's left over after hail, according to the verdict label, you have to wait 80 days. And so depending on when that hail damaged the crop relative to when that verdict was applied, as long as it was 80 days or more, you could graze the corn. However, if you plant, let's say you plant cereal ryegrass, for example, following that corn because of hail damage, and you want that to come up in the fall, or maybe you planted oats, you want that to come up late summer, early fall, and you want to graze that. This grazing restriction does not apply to those oats because now that's a subsequent crop. And so in order to plant the oats and be able to graze them, that goes back to those rotation restrictions. And so you need to look at the herbicide label for verdict and say, how long do I have to wait before I can replant oats? What does the label tell me in terms of replant or rotation restriction? And that's what will dictate whether or not you can forage that crop. And so if the rotation restriction for verdict was too long to be able to plant oats and then graze them, then you wouldn't be able to use oats in that situation. So two things to pay attention to. Grazing restriction is applying to the crop to which the herbicide was applied to. The other side of that is if I replant or rotate to another crop, can I graze those relative to that first herbicide? And that's a rotation restriction, so that's a different thing altogether. Last thing I want to touch on is this idea of additional herbicide applications. So there might be a situation where you want to keep the primary crop that was planted. Maybe you can get enough regrowth. Maybe the injury wasn't bad enough to need a replant, or it was a total failure. But that canopy opened up, and you want to make sure that you're getting good weed control in that system before fall, so that you're not increasing the seed bank. You're not having more weeds that are going to make combining a challenge. So any number of reasons you want to make sure you have good weed control to the end of the season. A couple things to think about though, if you're going to apply an additional herbicide to try to extend the amount of control you get now that that canopy's opened up. First thing to think about is you really need to pay attention to the label rate restrictions. So all herbicides are going to have some annual amount of herbicide that can be applied any given year. Atrazine is a great example. You can only apply so much atrazine in a year, and so if you used up that allotment of atrazine in the spring and you want to come back now that the canopy's opened up and apply more atrazine, you'd be restricted from that. Authority Max is another great example, and so it can be a challenge to track these things down. This is an Authority Max label that's up here, and you can see there's a lot of fine print. If you read your way through, you get to this section on this particular label that's called restrictions. And if you squint hard enough and you get your microscope out or your hand lens out and you read this, it tells you don't apply more than a single full rate of Authority Max in any given year. And so if you've already applied the full label rate in the spring for soybeans and you were thinking about reapplying or an additional application of Authority Max because that canopy opened up and you'd like that residual, well, in this instance you wouldn't be able to. You'd be restricted from doing that, and so you'd have to select a different product that still allowed an application in that year. The other thing to consider with a subsequent application, if you're going to apply later in the season over top of a crop that you're trying to save, paying attention to these pre-harvest intervals. And so there's a restriction in terms of how close you can be to harvest with your herbicide application. If you get too close, there's some risk that herbicide could go along with the harvested grain and enter the food stream, and so there's a restriction in how close you can get. And so just for an example, if you were to apply the product Cobra, you have to be at least 45 days prior to harvest in order to apply Cobra, otherwise you would be in violation of the label. And so the later you get in the season, the more important it is to pay attention to that pre-harvest interval for that subsequent application. Finally, I was just going to highlight a couple of herbicide options that might fit a system where you wanted to make a late season application following hail. And some of the things that I looked at, what are some products that have either long or no growth stage restrictions for the crop, so what allows you to apply to a fairly mature crop. Products that have relatively short pre-harvest intervals, so it allows you to get closer to that harvest time and still apply. And then finally, just paying attention, what are some products that would allow you to rotate either back to soybean or to corn the subsequent year, so you wouldn't be locked into one or the other. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. There's other products out there that could fit some of these categories. I just pulled out a few, and so this is looking at soybean. You have products like Select Max that are really good for grass control. Would be an option that fit those criteria. Group 2 herbicides like Classic or Scepter, some of the Group 14 PPO inhibitors, Cobra, Ultra Blazer, for example. And then Warrant would be a Group 15 herbicide, which would allow application all the way up to R2. And so these are a number of products that potentially, depending on the stage of the soybean when it was hailed out, could fit into that type of scenario where you could come back and you could apply one of these products over the top to extend that control just a little bit longer. Some options for corn. Corn has more products than soybean available in general for applying post-emergence, but corn tends to have an earlier cutoff. So many of the corn herbicides will cut off in that 8, 12, 24 inch range. But as you get a little bit more mature corn, there becomes fewer and fewer products available. And so if you get into a situation where you're getting closer to tassel and you have a hail event, the number of herbicides becomes a lot less. So I mentioned this earlier, but 2,4-D, if it's directed, with drop nozzles and directed and not broadcast over the top, could be used. Products like Basagran or Bucktrill can be applied all the way up to tassel. And then Impact is an HPPD inhibitor that, again, also has no growth restriction. So I ran through quite a bit there, highlighting a number of different things to think through. I just wanted to point out that a lot of these topics, a lot of these points were summarized in a CropWatch article that was released recently, and so you can go to the CropWatch website and you could find that article and you could review a number of these things there. And also feel free to contact me. So if you have any questions related to this, feel free to email me or call my office. I also occasionally will post some of these topics on Twitter as well. Thanks.